If there's one thing that is central to Morgan McSweeney's theory of electoral strategy, it's that Labour should be angling to win over Reform UK voters. This is manifested by Labour increasing the salience of migration policy and dropping policies that they think are too woke. Yet if there's one sector of the electorate who can't stand Labour, or Keir Starmer very much at all, it's Reform voters. As of June this year, Keir Starmer's favourability amongst Reform voters was a staggering -90. Hardly a ringing endorsement of his attempts to woo them with his hard pivot to an anti-immigration stance. And we may have some more of an explanation as to why Reform voters aren't buying his attempts at pandering to their concerns. And it's probably that they don't believe him. People in Starmer HQ may think the voters are too stupid to remember what he used to be like, but the internet never forgets and brings receipts like this.
Make no mistake, this plan means migration will fall. That's a promise. But I want to be very clear on this. If we do need to take further steps, if we do need to do more to release pressure on housing and our public services, then mark my words, we will.
Poor housing, poor public services are not the fault of migrants and people who've come here. They're political failure. Political failure.
I mean, of course, Starmer was originally correct. There was a great clip from a Unite the Union representative in the video he released about Lincolnshire the other day, pointing out, well, actually, this is a lack of investment problem. Keir Starmer was right to point that out. But of course, people aren't idiots. People remember what Keir Starmer was like. You can just look at clips. You can just find clips, go, what did Starmer believe about immigration? Just type it into Google before 2024 and you'll find out what he meant. And of course, he ran on this in the leadership election. One of his pledges was a humane migration policy, right? He has his name, he'd signed it. He signed it with his autograph in terms of these little pledge cards they had during the leadership election. And it just genuinely seems to me that the Labour leadership think that voters are idiots. Now, whilst most right-wingers will disagree with the left, they usually have more disdain for liars and hypocrites than they do for political adversaries. And now we have the polling to prove it. New polling seen exclusively by Novara Media, by Merlin Strategy, can reveal that Reform voters actually prefer Jeremy Corbyn to Keir Starmer on almost every single metric. A sample of 2,000 Reform UK supporters were asked to rate the two on a variety of metrics and say who they thought best fit the description for each. Corbyn was rated higher than Keir Starmer on authenticity, honesty, strength, intelligence, trustworthiness and radicalism, and also rated as being more for working people and more understanding of people like those surveyed. The only metric Starmer really scored higher on was how he appeared on the world stage, which tracks given that the foreign policy has always been something that Corbyn and the wider electorate have broadly disagreed on. The man himself said this in response to those results. People have lost faith in a political system that shuts them out of the decisions that affect their daily lives. The great dividers want you to think that migrants and minorities are responsible for the problems in our society. They aren't. Those problems are caused by a rigged economic system that protects the interests of billionaires and corporations. Now, what I think this speaks to is a really big divide, a really kind of new divide in politics, where broadly, in times of political crisis, in times of terminal decline, especially when both major parties have tried and failed, at least they are perceived to have failed in terms of Labour have only been in government for a year and they've already seemed to piss off huge swathes of the electorate and try to triangulate around, picking bits and pieces, just like as we saw with the recognition of Palestine statement, which was conditional, where he seemed to piss off everybody and win over nobody, that people aren't reacting to the centre ground, sensible politics, as they would describe it, of old. They don't want the grown-ups in the room. They want sincerity. They want action. They want people to grab the country by the scruff of the neck and say, this is what we need to do to fix everything. This is the plan that we've got to turn everything around. And the kind of triangulation politics that McSweeneyism, the Keir Starmer Politburo represent, it doesn't appeal to anybody. There was a class of people this certainly appealed to. It certainly appealed to them in the 90s and the 2000s when times were good. And there was a kind of expanding middle class and an expanding asset and home-owning middle class who got the boom of the house price inflation of the 2010s and the 2000s. This was a class of people who were a very aspirational class who broadly saw the economy as good and who could be used as the kind of the swing voter, the Mondeo man of the recent past to try and appeal to. But that, since the kind of gargantuan nature of private capital, of private equity, has kind of eaten into the wealth of the middle class in this country, as Gary Stevenson has rightly pointed out, that voting electorate is shrinking every single day. And given that more people than not are looking at this kind of country as in decline, they don't think the cost of living crisis will ever end. They want to see sincere politicians. They want to see politicians who take beliefs and they stick by them and they stand with them. And I think that is why, that despite their huge disagreements with Jeremy Corbyn on things such as migration policy and some agreements on things like nationalisation and workers' rights too, they are happy to see him as being at least superior to Keir Starmer in the fact that Keir Starmer just lies. He lies about everything. He is a morally corrupt serial liar, in the words of an LBC presenter who I won't name here. And that is one thing that you can't fool the electorate on. They know what he used to be like. They're not going to be fooled by you going, well, at this Labour Party conference, we're going to put up some union flags and we're going to sing the national anthem, and suddenly everyone will believe that the Labour Party has changed overnight. People aren't buying it. People aren't buying it at all. And they want to see politicians who actually have some solutions rather than just tinkering around the edges. Now, this dichotomy can be seen elsewhere in politics too. The Green Party leadership election has gotten a lot more publicity than anyone might have expected due to the breakout performance of Zach Polanski, the deputy leader. His platform is a change in comms and strategy, what he calls eco-populism, an approach rejected by his opponents Ellie Chowns and Adrian Ramsey. The co-leadership candidate spoke to The Guardian about the leadership contest, accusing Polanski of using quote-unquote polarising language and suggesting he could put off moderate voters. Both Chowns and Ramsey represent rural seats won from the Tories in 2024, which, compared to the urban seats won by the other two Green MPs, Sian Berry and Carla Denyer, demonstrates the party's kind of disparate voting bloc. Ramsey told The Guardian this about where he believes the mood of the nation is. I strongly believe that most British people have had enough with populist approaches to politics that seek to simplify everything, that are all about chasing the next headline, the next set of likes rather than real substance. There's no point in just speaking to a certain section of the public that already backs you. You have to communicate in a way that has broad appeal. Now, I want to take on a couple of these points here. Populism is not a lack of substance. This is a really, really important point, right? Populism is about a narrative. It's a narrative of the people versus the elites. The left wing should be populist. It should be populist. It should be the 99% against the 1%. It's the proletariat versus the bourgeois. It's the poor versus the rich. That is the real populism that the left should represent. Do you think Green Party policy represents that? I personally do. That's why I'm a member of the party. I support nationalisation. I support caps on CEO pay. I support universal basic income. I support a foreign policy based on humanity. These are all bits of substance, but it's the framing of this. Like, we support a reduction in CEO pay because they're the 1%. Right? We support nationalisation because it takes assets out of the hands of the 1% for the interests of the people. Right? People are seeing a country in decline, and they want a narrative to clutch onto for whose fault this is. People aren't going to respond to technocratic policy ideas. They're going to respond to, this is who is at fault, and this is how we're going to take the power back from them. And we're seeing this across, Reform and Green Party voters in terms of how they view society. They're fearful about the future, and they're skeptical of corporate power and the international kind of capitalist class, as what we would call them, is what Reform UK voters are actually pretty skeptical of, even though their party leader, in the form of Nigel Farage, also appeals to this kind of people as well, to those kind of capitalists. So the idea that this A, lacks substance, or B, doesn't have broad appeal, is just nonsensical. It's just not in any sense reality when you look at real polling here. And again, it's the same kind of appeal to the centre ground, this appeal to triangulation that is failing the Starmer administration right now in terms of making it look like you're trying to be too many things to too many people rather than having a set of principles, sticking to them and selling them to the electorate. Curtis, what do you think? What do you think voters value in 2025?
What I think is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be something called the Great Divide, shall we say. And there's going to be, I think, on one side, ethno-nationalism and hating of minorities. And on the other side, you're going to have left populism. Now, both sides are going to attack the minority. Again, the right wing will attack refugees, will attack immigrants, will attack wokeness. And the left is going to attack the real minority, which is ruining people's lives, the top 1%. That is what I think politics is going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years, because essentially liberalism is dead. I don't think there's a strong constituency for the kind of politics which is socially liberal but economically conservative. That is what we've had for a very, very long time. Think of David Cameron, for example, hug a hoodie whilst also instituting austerity, in which 330,000 people were killed. No one buys into that. In fact, it was never popular. I mean, the left hated it because, all right, socially, we had political correctness, right? So we didn't have as emboldened racists as we do today. But on econ policy, it wasn't left wing. As I said, privatization, tax cuts for the wealthy, and austerity. And the right, well, they hated liberalism because they simply hated social liberalism. They didn't like what they call is wokeness. So I think these are the two things that is that's going to be the future of politics. But for the left, right, it needs to put class front and center. It doesn't ignore social issues, by the way, absolutely doesn't. But it needs to be populist. Now, the polling where Jeremy Corbyn is far more popular than Keir Starmer, I mean, if you were paying attention, that is not surprising whatsoever. I can personally attest to this. I have a family member who voted for Jeremy Corbyn twice under Labour, still likes Jeremy Corbyn, thinks that Jeremy Corbyn was treated appallingly by the Labour Party, and now votes for reform. Now, for the pundit class, their brains explode. They say, I don't understand how that works. It's because people don't think in terms of left and right. They think of, by the way, political narratives. That's what's important. People give far more credit to someone when they disagree on policy, but they're honest about it. Now, someone like Keir Starmer, what he's tried to do is appeal to everyone. And when you try and do that in politics, you appeal to no one. So when he tries to sound tough on immigration to win over reform voters, people, those who are more likely to vote for reform, say, well, we don't really believe you. Whereas Jeremy Corbyn is far more liberal or left-wing on immigration. And a lot of reform people will know that, but they'll say, but at least we know where Jeremy Corbyn stands. He stood for the same things. And when it comes to left-wing, economic policy, you're going to get reform people on board when it comes to nationalisation, for example, when he speaks about the two-child benefit cap and cuts to benefits, which Keir Starmer still wants to keep the two-child benefit cap. When it comes to winter fuel allowance, that is deeply, deeply unpopular. So I think it's so important that we need to lean into populism. Now, what really worries me is Adrian Ramsey and Ellie Chance. I mean, Adrian Ramsey saying, I'm sick of this sort of populist rhetoric, the 99% versus the 1%. Ellie Chance saying that doesn't have broad appeal. It absolutely does. Trust me, it does. Now, a lot of us on the left talk about the centre ground collapsing. I don't think that's necessarily accurate because I don't think the centre ground has actually collapsed. What I think is more and more people have been politically engaged. And beforehand, not many people were. So politics was only for the briefcase centrists and it was their own little bubble. And now more and more people, left or right, are getting involved in the political process and they're finding out they don't like this. I mean, think of Brexit, for example, the largest democratic vote ever. Think of the rise of, the left wing. Look at polling of this new Jeremy Corbyn Zara Sultana Party without a name. So I don't think it's that the centre ground has collapsed. I mean, all my life I've been surrounded by people, and I'm sure many people watching this can attest to the same thing, that the average response you get from someone is politicians lie, they're all the same, voting doesn't really matter. That's not a new phenomenon. So I don't think the centre ground is really collapsed. I just think more and more people are getting involved in the political process and they're finding that centrism absolutely sucks. It's also on a policy thing. Centrism hasn't addressed the crisis we faced. So when it comes to, and I think the Green Party has a large portion of this debate when it comes to rhetoric and comms, because, I hosted a debate with Zach Blansky and Ellie Chance, and Zach said, this Green Party leadership isn't really to do with policy, it's to do with comms. And I find it extremely troubling that Ellie Chance is saying that, this sort of populist rhetoric doesn't wash. It absolutely does. Because as we go forward, as the right wing is becoming far more emboldened, far more comfortable with their politics. I mean, we've literally had people go on GB News and openly call for remigration, which is fascist politics, right? The left can't dilly-dally and go, oh, well, I don't know. We've got to be incredibly aggressive. We've got to say, people like Nigel Farage, people like Donald Trump, they're not scary and dangerous. No, they're losers who are cut to the billionaire class. They're weak. The left needs to come out and be strong and say, we're taking on the rich and powerful. Stand with us and say, do you want to go down a horrible dark path of blaming everything on refugees and migrants when you could actually be brave and stand up for the 1%? So the next 5-10 years, we can tell people, choose what side you're on. The side of the oligarchs, the billionaires, the richer, the people who want to get richer and richer, or you can stand with the working and middle classes and stand for yourself against the richest in society.
I think a really formative moment for this kind of populist wave, which has been brewing for a long time, is 2008. There was no reckoning across the world, really. There was no reckoning for the chaos that ensued, the bailout for the bankers that was never atoned for outside of countries like Iceland, where they went to jail, right? In most countries, they got away with it. And that fermented populism ever since then, because we've never had any redress for what happened to ordinary people in the wake of 2008. It led to austerity in this country. The austerity then led to a more Brexit as well. So there's been a continual backlash against the fact that the capture of society by the elite class has never been reined in. It's about trying to funnel this into the right direction to ensure that people focus on these people. Because a lot of talk about elites, about cultural elites. You see what Matt Goodwin says, that there's an elite class of academics. I'm like, well, are they the elites other than the bankers? But that's a compelling narrative that's being sold there. The only way, and I mean the only way that the left can win, is having a contrary narrative that speaks to real material concerns that people are facing right now. We have to fight back against the populist narratives coming from the right with populism of the left. And that's why I think that we see the rise of a new party of the left, the rise of Zach Polanski with the Greens as an important watershed moment in how we come back and redress and right what was never, and right the wrongs that were never righted in the first place.